My name is Joy Connor, and I'm co-leader with Lisa of the Wellspring Community of Australia. On behalf of the Wellspring Community, I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us this afternoon from all over the planet by the look of things. It's pretty good. For those who haven't heard of the Wellspring Community before, we're an Australian inclusive Christian community which began around 25 years ago. We aim to create a space where spirituality and justice meet, to deepen our relationship with God, to care for the earth, to foster the growth of an Australian spirituality, and to practice peace, including working for a just relationship between First Nation communities and latecomers. We are inspired by the spirituality of Iona community in Scotland, and you can Google Wellspring Community to find us on the web. If you're outside Australia, you'll need to Google Wellspring Community Australia to find us. This seminar begins a year of deep listening and heart connection around care for creation to nurture the communal soul of Australia, organised by the Wellspring Community and partners. We are ambitious. I'd like to thank Deanne Speed for organising the seminar, Brooke Prentis for taking on the role of moderator, Naomi Wolfe for sharing her understanding of identity, and also to thank Rani, who can't be with us because she has been caught up in quite a violent incident on the bus that she was using to get to the place she was going to talk to us from. So it's very sad that we won't remember this time. Now, before we go any further, I think it's really important that we acknowledge the horrific events which led to the death of a 15-year-old Indigenous teenager, Cassius Tovey, in Western Australia this week. This is a stark reminder of how much attention our Australian soul needs. We're fortunate that our current Prime Minister is prepared to stand up and name the racism and the heartbreak. However, the fact that such an act should happen at all is unthinkable, especially when the head of police in Western Australia described described it as probably a case of mistaken identity, as if it was all right to bash Indigenous children to death if they were the ones you were chasing in the first place. As a mark of respect and solidarity with the grieving First Nation community, we're going to stop for a short period of silence and remember this teenager whose life was cut short, Cassius Tovey. So let's sit quietly and remember. Okay, I think now I'll hand over to my co-leader, Lisa, who's going to bless our afternoon. Thanks, Lisa.
Creator and creating God, may our eyes see what you see. May our ears hear what you hear. May our hearts be open to listen and learn from each other. Thank you, God, for the precious opportunities like today to deepen our connection with each other. Bless us as we share this time together. Amen. And I have the pleasure to introduce Brooke Prentis, who is curating our gathering today and will introduce our speaker as well as herself. Thanks, Brooke.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with the Wellspring community. I acknowledge Rani Lester in this moment as well as not being able to join us. And as we've just taken a moment's silence for Cassius Tovey and his families, He is a relation of the Kickett families, a very well-known Aboriginal Christian family. And so I particularly want to pay my respects to all of his family, many who are known to myself and to Naomi and to Rani. So it's not an abstract concept. This is family for us as well. And I've put his name in the chat so that if you aren't aware of his story, please go and read the story, pray for the family, and provide whatever advocacy you are able to. There's national rallies taking place next week, and so please support in any way that you can. My name is Brooke Prentis. I'm an Aboriginal Christian leader. I am a Wakka Wakka woman. Today I'm on Wakka Wakka country. I hadn't thought about introducing myself, but you can find out all about me on my website, brookeprentis.com. I've had an incredible career as a chartered accountant, one of only 30 Indigenous chartered accountants in all of Australia. I'm a company director and had the privilege of being the CEO of Common Grace, and was the very first Aboriginal person in these lands now called Australia to be a CEO or national leader of a national Christian organisation that wasn't specifically Indigenous. And today I'm an Aboriginal and education consultant, having started up my own business since leaving Common Grace, and doing amazing things in schools and with organisations, and helping people actually do reconciliation action plans to make them not just pieces of paper, but actually to build relationship, to make change in these lands now called Australia. And have been working on my book, which is due for release next year, more like May due to delays with the publisher, May next year, and hopefully under the title Listen, Learn, Love, Walking with Your Aboriginal Neighbour, and a really practical guide. So really excited for what next year holds. But as an introduction to myself, it is a privilege to bring an acknowledgement of country for us all today. And so we enter the space, the deep listening of acknowledging country. It's especially exciting for me to bring this acknowledgement of country today as I sit on my own country. I am on Wakka Wakka country today. And Wakka Wakka country is 3 hours drive northwest of Meanjin, of Brisbane, and Brisbane being on the countries of Turrbal country, Yuggera country, and Jaggera country. And Wakka Wakka country is the place of the bunya pines and the native grasslands, and also the whiptail or pretty-faced wallabies that are actually right outside my window right now in my backyard. So it's very exciting, as well as a king parrot who's visited for the first time. They are across this region, but haven't seen them in my backyard, and has visited me today. And so together today, we come together online. And so it's an opportunity to acknowledge. And so we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples in these lands now called Australia. I do acknowledge that we have international guests with us as well, and encourage you to find out your own Indigenous story, and especially the land's now called Canada or Turtle Island. I can see Nancy having renamed that and claiming the name of Turtle Island, which is important to Indigenous people all across the world. And so I'd like to take this opportunity for you to open up the chat. So if you press on the chat to open it up, because in this moment online, I'm going to ask each person, if you know, to type the name of the Aboriginal nation that you sit upon today and which you listen upon today. And if you want to add your own acknowledgement of country to the chat. So I'll give you a few moments to do that before I continue. And so this is a practice I've done, and it's really beautiful to see all the different nations come up in the chat. So if you have it open, you'll start to see all those nations roll through. And so we'll just pause for a few more moments while people have the opportunity to do that. So from Wakka Wakka country to Darug and Gundungara country to Jagera country, Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Ghana country, Awabakal country, Darkinjung country. We've also got internationally Aotearoa, the land's now called New Zealand, and from Turtle Island, Anishinaabe land being recognised there amongst other nations, Pumbamary country, and so many others. And so I continue as those come through to acknowledge country. The traditional custodians have been and continue to be stewards and caretakers of country, as they have been for thousands of years, for millennia, since time immemorial, and since appointed and placed in these lands by the Creator. In my words, country is not just land and country is not just peoples. Country is all lands, waters, sky, trees, plants, animals, birds, fish, rocks, mountains, and all peoples. And whilst non-Indigenous peoples can't be from country, so I ask you to listen to your own language. You can be born on country, can live on country, but it's Aboriginal peoples that are from country. But it doesn't mean that you don't belong here. And as Aboriginal peoples, we feel a responsibility to you as a law given by the Creator to us to be in right relationship. And you are part of country today. And beneath the concrete and the bitumen, or beneath the floorboards, or whatever's beneath the carpet, beneath your feet right now, the land holds many stories, all the ceremonies and celebrations it's seen and heard and been present to since time immemorial. I pay my respects, and on behalf of us, our respects to the elders past, present, and future. In paying my respects, it is actually a deep thank you to the elders past and present. They are real people. And I especially thank the elders of the present for the way in which they refresh, revitalise, and maintain culture. I especially thank the elders of the past and present, and remember my role into the future to continue the fight for equality, justice, reconciliation, conciliation, and above all, for love. I acknowledge, even though she is not here, she is here with us in spirit, Rani Lester, an Adnyamathanha woman, and with us here in person, Naomi Wolfe, a Trawloolway woman. I pay my respects for Rani and to Naomi. I pay my respects to your country, to your elders, and to your family. If there are any other Aboriginal peoples or Indigenous peoples from other lands here today, I extend the same respect. And to any Torres Strait Islander peoples, I extend my respect, acknowledgement, and friendship. As I say and teach, an acknowledgement of country is more than just words. It's about our hearts and minds coming together through a genuine want and act of building relationship with Aboriginal peoples. I promise to respect country, to walk softly and gently on country, and to listen deeply on country, on these ancient lands. And I call you to do the same, as we remember the words of many Aboriginal elders who say and teach us, care for country, and country will care for you. And I declare that sovereignty has never been ceded. Thank you for acknowledging country with me today. And so it is a great privilege to have Naomi Wolfe, who, as I've already said, is a Trawloolway woman, with us today and presenting to us on this theme of identity and country in a First Nations context. Naomi is lecturing in Indigenous Studies at Whitley College in the University of Divinity in the NAITS program. That's NAIITS. Which was formerly the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies, but is now a global Indigenous theological community and institute, particularly focused at the master's and PhD level in our theological colleges around the world now. Naomi is completing a research master's degree on women of the late Second Temple period at the Australian Catholic University. And her particular interests, and I've learnt lots from her in these interest areas, include Indigenous pedagogies and obviously theology. I first met Naomi when I was one of the first Aboriginal students to be part of the NAITS Masters program in 2016, 2017. Naomi came along to say hello to the students, and through her relationship and a long relationship that I have with Aboriginal theologian Auntie Patricia Courtenay, Naomi is a well-respected member of the global Indigenous theology community. Naomi spends most of her time on Wurundjeri country in Naarm, the place now called Melbourne. That's where I met her. And I've personally appreciated Naomi's passion for breaking down barriers and challenging stereotypes, as well as Naomi having the tenacity to learn and navigate university systems in these lands now called Australia. And with that as an introduction, I look forward to listening to Naomi on this topic of identity and country in a First Nations context. So a very warm welcome to you, Naomi.
Thanks, sis. Wow, not sure my head's going to fit through my study door with all of that, but thank you. I too would like to acknowledge country. As Brooke said, I am on Wurundjeri country where I've been welcomed for many a decade now, and I'm raising my young nephew who's 13. He's with me and may pop in through the door to ask some important question about food, etc. But I would like to acknowledge that I am on Wurundjeri country, and as I am a Yannabal, so a visitor to Wurundjeri country, I'm a Trawloolway woman from northeast Tasmania, as is the Wurundjeri protocol and my own cultural protocol, to acknowledge and pay respects to the elders and to the community past and present, and to agree to live within the protocols of Wurundjeri people while I'm here, so that I don't get sick, so that they don't get sick. I'd like to acknowledge Brooke and Rani and all of the other Aboriginal communities that we have across Australia and the Torres Strait Islander communities. And I know that at the moment we are all grieving from shock. Particularly, I had time with Cassius's uncle Mark on the weekend in Sydney. And I'm conscious, you know, this young kid is 2 years older than my nephew that I have here, 1 year younger than another nephew. So these things for us in community are personal, and we grieve because we never know when it'll happen again. So our thoughts and our prayers, not in a trite way, but in a lived way, in a hopeful way, go out to the families of young Cassius and the families of the young Aboriginal men who have just died in prison in the last 4 weeks here in Melbourne. Country is grieving, and we want to acknowledge that and pay our respects. The country is living as well, and it's hopeful. So I am a Trawloolway woman. I work as a theologian and as a historian. And for a long time, I've been grappling, particularly when I grew up, how do I become fully who I'm supposed to be? How do I become fully Christian and fully Aboriginal in a way that I don't have to, as previous generations, sacrifice one or the other? And so for me, it became obvious that a lot of work needed to be done, not work in our own community, because frankly, many in our own community are already bicultural. What do I mean by that? Well, they can walk and live and work and think and breathe in their own indigeneity, but they can also do the same in the Western world. And so it seemed to me that we need more of people like Brooke, Rani and others, Uncle Mark, Auntie Anne, Auntie Janet, Auntie Patricia, to help the Western world understand what it might be to be Indigenous and what it might mean to share lands that are Indigenous lands, but that are predominantly populated by settler communities. And I acknowledge that there are many communities around the world, those who are visibly Indigenous and those who aren't, those whose occupations happened 700, 800, 900 years ago. There is a challenge when we talk about identity. It can be very fraught for a lot of people. So let me talk in general terms, and perhaps we might have time for some discussion. But when we talk about country, it's more than just the land. It's community, it's culture. It's a different interpretation than what some other communities might call country. It's hard to commodify country in Indigenous ways of thinking. Western ideas of country are usually property ideas. There's an ascribed ownership and an ascribed monetary value. And that's not how it works necessarily in Indigenous communities. We talk about country in the same way that we might talk about a person. And we have a relationship with country that is different from other people's ideas of country. Many of our mobs say that country knows, country sees us, country loves us, country takes care of us, country grieves, and country celebrates. And through our remembering, through our connectedness to country, we're able to enter into that grief, enter into that celebration, to worry about country. And for many of us with the floods and the bushfires and earthquakes and all things, our elders are saying we're worried about country. And not just for Aboriginal people, but for everybody who's living in country that is acting so differently from what previous generations have experienced. So country for Aboriginal people is very connected to your identity. It's your nation, it's your group, it's it's who we are. It involves not only the tangible. So we'll talk about country. It's not just the land, not just the waterways, it's the skies and so on. But there's an intangibility perspective, and that comes into it as well. There's a reciprocal relationship, and it's not just reciprocal between humans. Yes, we do have that. My dad reminded me not long before he died that, we have no rights until we discharge our responsibilities. And our responsibilities are not just to our human relatives. The rest of creation is our family. The rest of creation is sacred as we are sacred. The rest of creation cares for us, and we should be caring for creation. So country is not human-centric, and country is not hierarchical. And sometimes that's difficult for many in the Western world who have grown up with that idea that in the book of Genesis or other religious texts that humans have dominion and power and some kind of God authority to have the only rights and no responsibility. So country for us is a living entity. There's a consciousness. We don't worship country. We don't worship trees, any of that. We're not animists. We're not pagans. Not that there's anything wrong with being an animist or a pagan, but it is about being in right relatedness as co-creators, as carers for creation. And so for a really long time in this country, that was not understood. That was not appreciated, and certainly wasn't part of theological training or any other training for a really, really long time. And for a really long time, theological training and other training was about a Eurocentric idea of how Aboriginal people thought and how they could think and what they should study. And so we are in the Nates Indigenous community across the world, we're always getting questions from well-meaning people who say, but can the Indigenous people study at university? But do they want to? And I always respond by saying, well, why would you think that they couldn't? Have you ever had a conversation with an Indigenous person and asked them, hey, what are you interested in? So for many Indigenous peoples, to enter into institutions or cultural groups that are not our own sometimes requires us in many ways to try and assimilate in order for membership, in order to survive. And so what NAITS and other groups are working on is that middle ground, that structure of how can Indigenous peoples around the world, and here in this country, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, how can we be fully who the Creator made us to be? And that is, we were made as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and Indigenous peoples. Because otherwise we have a number of theological conundrums. If we were meant to change and be non-Indigenous, does that mean the Creator made a mistake? Does that mean the Creator created us, Indigenous peoples all around the world, and then just went, actually, what they should be is one particular type of person, which is historically located in post-Enlightenment times? So does Creator make a mistake? Or do we as humans perhaps get carried away with human-centric ideas? Certainly in this country, there was an inability or an unwillingness of many people who came since 1788 to acknowledge that some of the beliefs that we have and some of the experiences that we talk about are very similar to what the ancient Jewish communities experienced, the communities in the New Testament times experienced. But for some reason, that there was never the correlation. And it always struck me as a child, after I heard a particular sermon in an Anglican church. I'm an Anglican and a Roman Catholic. I know, reconciliation in action there, folks. I heard God is the Alpha and the Omega. And I thought, okay, what the heck does that mean? And I went to the priest afterwards and I said, what does that mean? And he said, it means God has always been here and God will always be there. God was there in the beginning, God is there in the end. And I said, so God is everywhere? And the priest said, yes, God has always been everywhere, every time. And I thought, okay then. So God didn't arrive on these shores in 1788. If God is the Alpha and the Omega, then God has always been here. And so if we start to look at that idea, we start to realise God was always in Australia, that God didn't arrive in 1788, and that the Creator blessed Indigenous communities here and around the world with skills and responsibilities to country, to care for our communities and to care for those who come to join our lands and our seas. But for a really long time, I and other Indigenous peoples who were interested in theology, interested in bringing the two worlds together, it wasn't something that was welcome. And so for me, it was a great challenge to my identity. How could I be who the Creator made me to be when the church itself was saying what the Creator had made me was wrong? And so for many of our young people, they're lost. They know that they don't have a warm welcome in non-Indigenous society. They are told day after day, particularly our young men, being Aboriginal, being Torres Strait Islander is a bad thing. I know of many young Aboriginal men and women who try really hard to get all of the pieces of paper in the white world and to do the best by their community. only to find themselves in a mental and a spiritual crisis, because it would seem that nothing they can do brings them hope and healing. And unfortunately, events of what's happened recently and the comments that come about mistaken identity, or what was the kid doing there, and what was this, there's always a lot of victim blaming. And our kids hear that, they see it and they read it. And it's hard for our elders to reassure them, because we actually can't tell the children in our community it won't happen to you. So I don't say these things to guilt you. Guilt is a useless emotion in this circumstance. Guilt does a number of things in this circumstance. If you haven't done something like racism and discrimination and terrible events, and someone tries to make you feel guilty, you get rightly angry and you shut down. You go, I'm not talking to her. She's trying to make me feel guilty for something I didn't do, and that's not fair. So your anger shuts you down. And then we get no further into right relatedness, no further into conversation, no further down the journey to living in a world that is just and full of mercy and love. And then the other emotion that I see with guilt is that some people become so overwhelmed and so overwhelmed with the emotions of what's happened, and that becomes their sole focus. How sad they are, how awful they feel, how helpless they feel. And so they shut down too, because they're not really looking at the wider picture. So I don't say these things to make anyone feel guilty. I say these things to tell you that it is part of our identity. It is one part of our identity that is urgent. There are other parts of identity within our communities that we willingly want to share. Creator gave Indigenous communities right around the world amazing gifts that we don't want to hold back. We've never wanted to hold back. We want to be, as John Paul II said so many years ago in Blatherskite Park in Alice Springs, we want to be joyfully received so that the church truly becomes who it was meant to be. But we can't do that until you learn a bit more about our shared history, the settler societies that are built on Indigenous lands. And that means work in your own community, and that means some of you listening and learning from us, but going back and teaching your own community, because we can't do this all by ourselves, folks. We'll never get to true healing and true reconciliation if we don't have time where our communities work upon themselves. For a really long time, the burden has been on Indigenous communities to educate non-Indigenous people, to fix the issues, to make people understand, to provide the cultural knowledge. There's a time for that, but there's also a time, and it's past overdue, for settler communities to do their homework. And Brooke's exercise before about getting you to name your traditional lands is a wonderful start, and use that to springboard more. Where did your church denomination get its money from? Where was it built? Who were the early settlers and founders of your church community? What were the early relationships with Indigenous peoples? And if you live somewhere like Wales or Ireland or Scotland, I recognise that there has been colonisation there too. What does it mean to be Welsh in colonised times? What does it mean to be Scottish and Irish? So these are journeys that we have to go on. And if you're a settler in Indigenous lands, then there's a sense of urgency. It's time to do some work. It's going to be difficult at times. We know that. because we already are doing the difficult work. We're already in 2, 3 worlds. But we know that there is the hope of a brighter tomorrow where 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds can walk to school and not be attacked, where Indigenous peoples can go and do a PhD in whatever they want to, if they want to, where Indigenous peoples who want to go into ministry will be given parishes and congregations of all types and sizes and places. Indigenous communities have a lot of hope. We have a lot of humour. We have a lot of tenacity. We know that the non-Indigenous world can achieve great things, but we need champions within the non-Indigenous world. We need people who know their own culture and are settled in that and willing to work alongside their brothers and sisters as we grapple with these difficult issues. So for me, a lot of my identity and connectedness to country is making sure that the next generation has it a lot better than my grandmother's generation or the ones before, or indeed my dad's generation. So it is really great to come and speak with the Wellspring community. I am sorry that Rani has experienced that awful, awful occasion and isn't here to be with us. I'm glad Sister Brooke is. And I'm hoping that we can, I know we're all over the world, and thank you for those people who got up in the middle of the night or stayed up late. It would be great to have some time to speak about these issues and to answer your questions, because, you know, Brooke and I, you know, we have different experiences. We come from different countries, so you won't get the Aboriginal answer, and that's okay. But in my experience, often people don't have the opportunity to ask questions because they don't have the forum to do so, or they're a little reticent because they think, oh, can't ask that. Well, perhaps I can say, as my dad would have said, it's ask an Aborigine time. So thank you, Wellsprings, for having me. I have been doing a little Google searching, etc., about what you do, and I think it's an amazing community and obviously an amazing worldwide connectedness. So Yapalingana in my people's language. Good to see and hear you speak.
Thank you so much,
Back over to
Naomi.
you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all those different points. And so just before we go to the questions, I would like anyone that has a question, if you can, please put it into the chat. I do have a few questions. If you haven't put them into the chat, you can send them to me directly to me if you want them to remain anonymous for some reason. And as you're thinking about the questions, I guess out of what Naomi's shared with you, even from the acknowledgement of country that I brought as well for us, some things to get you to start thinking about. What did you hear for the first time? What have you heard for the first time today? What might have challenged you? And thinking about Wellspring community and the Iona community, are there any similarities between what Naomi's presented about country with the way you live and be and do in your communities? And now, what questions do you have? So I'd love some questions. I've got one already. But Naomi, I might just start with a question for you. And you did present this in your presentation, but just to pull it out, what are some of the, for non-Indigenous Christians, what do you think are the stereotypes or misunderstandings that non-Indigenous Christians specifically have about the Aboriginal sense of country? Or maybe another way, what do non-Indigenous Christians get wrong? or things that they've said that are strange or even offensive?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think we worship country, like, you know, we go out and have some kind of strange Hollywood ceremonies. That's the one that comes up most. I teach at university, and people are always asking about rituals and what do you do in rituals, and I'm like, well, the same as anyone does in rituals. I think a lot of people cannot get it through their head that you can be Aboriginal and Christian, you can be Torres Strait Islander and Christian, and I say, well, you can be Irish and Christian, you can be Spanish and Christian, you can be Euro-Australian and Christian. What's the deal? And then some people will say, oh yes, but Galatians says neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And I say, okay, that means everybody. So if we leave our culture at the door, then you leave your culture at the door. And that's not what's been happening. So come on. If we're going to look at the text, let's look at the text. And let's apply the text to everybody. So that's a frustration, that there's a lot of misinformation that people then apply to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They seem to think that that something from one community is the same everywhere. And that's obviously not true. We've got over 300 nations. It'd be like saying, you know, people in France do this because people in Germany do this. So they're all the same. So yeah, the idea that we in some way are, you know, bound to the devil, that we're cursed, all of those things come in, and that we have to break off the shackles of our indigeneity in order to become Christians. And that's just not true. And it's deeply problematic because it sends the wrong message to our mob. It says, you're not welcome here. And God made you bad. God made you bad. Like, think of the theological conundrums out of that. Either God made us and then forgot about us and then sent other people to remind us that God existed, or that God, you know, we didn't know that God existed, so told us. Or God decided to make us and then forget about us. It's just, there's not a lot of nuanced thinking when people look at Indigenous spirituality and Indigenous theological ideas. And that's deeply frustrating because a lot of it is born out of ignorance, but a lot of it is born out of racist assumptions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do not have highly developed systems of thinking, systems of doing and thinking and being. And yes, Jesus wasn't a Westerner. I mean, I love pointing out to some people that when you go into church, you have this very Eurocentric idea about Jesus. And then you start breaking it down and you say, well, which Christianity are we going to follow today? A Greco-Roman Christianity? A Middle Eastern Christianity? What are we doing here? So the biggest frustration I find is that people will have a lot of misinformation, and that's why I say it's important that they go and do the history and understand their history, their part of the story, and also Indigenous stuff, because otherwise the cycle gets repeated. And in many places they think by putting up a plaque or a message stick or having someone to come and speak, it is a transformation. It's not. It's a great thing, but we need to do more than that. We need to actually do the work, and that's only the window dressing. That's the invitation, if I can put it more nicely. That's the invitation to do the work. So I've got on my soapbox. Brooke, you shouldn't have asked me that question. So there you go.
No, thank you very much for the response, Naomi. And I think if I can just add to, you know, our understanding of country and identity, one of the things I talk about is that Aboriginal people, our cultural values, two of our deep cultural values are hospitality and generosity. And so when you're thinking about identity of Aboriginal people, to actually think about us as being the most hospitable people you've ever met and the most generous people that you've ever met. And, you know, that's how our societies have operated and continue to operate for thousands of years, and even today, the sense of sharing the resources that we have, that respect for our elders and listening to those that have gone before us, just so important in today's Australia and today's world. And I think if I can also add to what Naomi said, please get your information from Aboriginal Christian leaders if it's a particular Christian response, and even think about we're not all of the same. Those that have done the theological work, those that are in the pastoral work, those who are artists, we have all these different skills and giftings as well. But make sure as a first point, you've actually got your information directly from Aboriginal Christian leaders. We're easy to find. You can find us. You got us today. You got Naomi and I today, which is amazing. Instead of repeating the stereotypes and the myths of non-Indigenous Christians backwards and forwards. So, Naomi, we had a question earlier from Diane about recently an Indigenous speaker drew attention to the fact that human beings come from the dust and return to the dust. The speaker said that the origin means something like a family relationship with the land itself. Would you like to comment on that at all?
Yeah, we can't separate ourselves from creation. None of us, whether we're, as my nan would say, black, white or brindle. Creation sustains us. Creation gave birth to us. And for Aboriginal people, you know, when we hear the scripture, you know, unto dust you shall return, that makes sense to us. For us, we wanted to go back to country if possible, but we know that upon death we rejoin creation in a new and different way. And so it is very important for us to know our cultural histories when we're talking about connectedness, and to know the historical realities. And that means for us, whether we're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, it's knowing the cultural history and reality of the text that we've inherited too. You know, knowing that there's more than one creation story in Genesis. Knowing exactly what the text says rather than just one or two phrases that people will use to have kind of a tennis match of backwards and forwards. So for Indigenous peoples around the world, yes, we have a more conscious connection, and that resonates when we talk about dust or water or the stars or the sky. But non-Indigenous people have that too. We know that, we read it. It's embodied in our faith.
Yeah, thanks for that response, Naomi. And I guess to add something from myself, I keep thinking about like the Indigenous worldview as opposed to a Western worldview. So when you look at all the different elements of society, so, you know, your social, political, environmental, ecological, spiritual, physical, all of those for Aboriginal people are supposed to be in harmony and in rhythm, and pre-colonisation were. Economic as well. One is not prioritised at the expense of the other. But in a Western worldview, and in the Australia that we live in today, well, the Australian governments that we live through today over the last 250 years, those are prioritised all the time. And when we think about specifically care for creation, I'm sure many of us could name so many examples of where economy has been put before ecological and environmental. When we look at our COVID times here in these lands now called Australia, political put before social. You know, we still have so many vulnerable members in our community in these lands now called Australia who have been forgotten about, their health concerns. And so you know, to think about those ways that can be in rhythm, taught to us by the Creator, who gave us the law in how to care for country, to know who the Creator is, care for country, and live in that right relationship. And whilst humans have a part of country, peoples are part of country, the land, the waters, the sky, the trees, the plants, the animals, the birds, the fish, the rocks, the mountains, and then all the peoples, we each have our different role to play, but there's this interconnectedness. And so often here today in these lands now called Australia, they're separated. I had some students just recently say to me, why do you name the fish and the birds separately? And I said, well, they're different to the animals. And I said, I often grieve because I don't name the insects, and the insects have an important role to play. And it was the first time they'd heard fish and birds as separated from animals. And I said, but it helps you to visualize the difference and the need to care for all of these elements of country, doesn't it? And they're like, oh, yeah, it does. So, Naomi, we've got another question about non-Indigenous Christians have treated Indigenous people in the past because of the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been treated in the past, say through missions, and some may be wary of white Christian people today. So can you suggest ways in which non-Indigenous Christians can stand with Aboriginal people today? You finished your presentation with a very strong call, and I wonder if you've got something else to say in that regard. Or even how you personally also view the past injustices and present injustices of non-Indigenous Christians on Aboriginal Christians today.
Yeah. Look at heavy stuff. It is absolutely heavy stuff. But unless we start the work, we're not going to get anywhere further. The next generation going to be talking about this, and the generation afterwards, and so on. And that would be incredibly sad for all of us. And quite frankly, I'm not sure creation, the non-human creation, has that much time to waste another 2 or 3 generations. So it seems to me that we could do better at communicating. But in order for that to happen, in order for you to stand as allies, to be friends, you actually got to do the work to educate yourselves and then educate your family. You know, Erna Hackett, who's a Korean American, says, go get your cousins. Go talk to your family. Go talk to the people in your community. Don't look outward about how you can help another group until you've worked out internally what is making you sick. The best intentions have been disastrous on Indigenous communities around the world. Deaths in custody, stolen generations, residential schools. The best intentions are not great lived realities. So the best way at the moment, I believe, and I'm only speaking on my own behalf, not any institution that I work for, and indeed some of my family may not even agree, so you're getting it from me. Do the work on your own in your communities. Do the work to acknowledge what's happened. Do the work to understand the shared histories, go educate the people who are finding this problematic, who are writing the policies that are best intention but horrible outcomes. That's what's needed, because everything else hasn't worked. We're still in the same cycle. I'm still getting students at university who don't know Indigenous history, but they don't know their own history. I can tell you this year, 70% of my undergraduate students came into my Aboriginal history course and told me that in January 26, 1788, Captain James Cook sailed up Botany Bay. And I said, not possible. And one earnest young man said, I bet you my mum and dad's house he did. And I thought, and I said, look, I'm not a betting woman, you know, but where does your mum and dad's house And he said, and he named quite a rich suburb. And I went, oh, I could fit a lot of mob in that. And he said, well, you're not going to get it. What are you going to give me? And I said, well, if I was a betting woman, I would bet you knowledge. And I would bet you that I had the right answer, because I know my Australian history as well as my Indigenous history. And I said, so most kids come to my classes with their laptops, some for legit reasons, others for not. I said, Google Captain Cook death, and then tell me what comes up. Tell me the date. Tell me the place. And as he's doing that, I can hear him saying, and then I see his face fall. And I said, I'm not going to embarrass you by asking you to read out what I know you've just read. But here's a problem, folks. You are busy arguing against me when I'm telling you Aboriginal history, and yet you don't even know your own place in this story. So perhaps you could spend more time knowing your own place in this story before you think it's okay to come and tell us what we're not doing right. Best intentions are really, really bad news for many Indigenous peoples, because they're founded on no knowledge or misinformation, and bundle that up with racist ideas, eugenics, the whole lot, misinterpreted text from the Bible or any other religious text. It's not working, folks. So let's try something different. Do the work in our own communities, and then let's meet. Let's meet in the middle ground and say, okay, how do we make this a wonderful place of affirming creation, a place of hope, instead of repeating the old cycles?
Thank you, Naomi. Very wise words for all of us. And as I do whenever I speak, I encourage each of you to at least find 3 people this week who were not part of this Zoom online webinar to have a conversation. Firstly, to share the 3 Aboriginal Christian leaders, Brooke Prentis, Naomi Wolfe, Rani Lester, and where our country is, Wakka Wakka, Naomi Trawloolway and living on Wurundjeri country, and Rani Adnyamatna and mainly living on Kaurna country. We share these things as part of ourselves. They're part of our story. But if you don't know where Wakka Wakka country is and Wurundjeri country is, please Google it. We've shared a part of ourselves today, and that's a story that you can tell. But tell people about the things that you've learned. Start to break down those myths and stereotypes. So your homework is to find 3 people this week to have a conversation with. Naomi and I and Rani, we can't reach all of Australia. Sometimes I wish I could, but I know...
I don't. That sounds tiring, Brooke.
We've tried the education, but it's about that relationship, and with your family, your friends, your work colleagues, those members of your community who aren't here today. We've got to get out of our heads and into our hearts. The head knowledge is really important as well, but hopefully that information becomes transformation. And we can't do that without your assistance as our non-Indigenous friends, having those conversations, making it intentional and keeping it going. Just a couple of brief words about our connection to country. For an Aboriginal person, you'll hear us say where we're from. So I'm from Wakka Wakka country. I have not lived my life on Wakka Wakka country. So it's only been in the last 12 months I've lived on Wakka Wakka country. And so where we are from is where our family heritage comes from. So that's back to my great grandmother, and then all of my generations before, over 2,000 generations on Wakka Wakka country. And that's my maternal side. So my mum, back to my mum's mum, my nan, and my nan's mum, my great grandmother. My non-Indigenous side, my dad's side, there's Scottish and English heritage. And I know that pretty much just as well as my Wakka Wakka heritage, but until the rest of non-Indigenous Australia is put under the microscope for their identity, then you know, I refer to myself as a Wakka Wakka woman. But it's part of my story as well. And I grew up on Gubbi Gubbi country, and so that's an important part of my story. Born on Yindinji country in far north Queensland, also an important part of my story, and for Aboriginal peoples. And so listen deeply to the parts of our story that we're sharing. Our nations aren't just about geography. And I think, Lisa, you had the AATSIS Aboriginal map of Australia, which you can each purchase. I'm on a mission to get this in every classroom and church in Australia. But get the small one and put it up in your home. It's not perfect. There are nations missing, like north of the Brisbane River in Brisbane is Turrbal country. That's not on the map, and there are many nations that are missing. But it's a conversation starter as well. And it's not just about geography, it's about our story, and that includes your story. If you're living here in these lands now called Australia today, or even around the world as you look to these lands now called Australia, and friends with your Aboriginal peoples of over 300 nations in these lands now called Australia. So, Naomi, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your friendship, for being parts of this event hosted by Wellspring Community today.
You're all very welcome. Brooke, can I finish with two blessings? So I want to finish with an Iona blessing, and then one from our Aboriginal Catholic community. The one from Iona that I particularly like, that I got from a retreat one day, was when you are deep in the earthy, messy thick of it, may you remember to look up at the stars and to wonder. And I've always loved that. And then from our Aboriginal elder, Auntie Betty Pike, who's in her 90s now, a Noongar woman who, when I first met her, I did a double take because she looks exactly like my great aunt who died 6 months before. And she did a double take because she said, I know you from somewhere. We still haven't figured it out. But she has a blessing that I want to leave you with. May you always stand as tall as a tree, be as strong as the rock Uluru, as gentle and still as the morning mist. Hold the warmth of the campfire in your heart, and may the Creator's Spirit always, always walk with you. Thanks for having me today, folks. I really appreciate the questions. I know we didn't get them all, but you have an invitation from Brooke and from me, and I'm sure if Rani was here, you would have one from her.
Thank you, Naomi. And I think I'm handing back over to Diane, but also I just wanted to share Rani's book, which isn't coming through. There it is. Walking to Corroboree. Rani co-authored and co-illustrated this book, and it's a beautiful representation of her Adnyamathanha culture and language. And so I encourage you to get a copy of Walking to Corroboree. And over to you, Diane.
Brooke, thank you very much for that, and particularly for managing to quickly tell us about Rani's book there at the end. That was that's great. It's another way of her having her with us this time, and we hope certainly another time. But both of you, Naomi, you really carried the weight of this gathering together in many ways, and thank you for your generosity in sharing for really quite a long period there without making it seem a minute too long. We could have gone on listening, and I'm sure we could have gone on listening to more from Brooke as well. Thank you both so much for your sharing of your time and your insights, I guess, for want of a better word. I think we're probably all feeling a little bit so full-hearted, so full, that we need to think over and let expressions and thoughts and moments come back to us. But in amongst it, I think we can say that there've been a lot of great eye-openers, and you have been leading us in words and in mood, both of you, into a deeper and wider understanding of what we might have thought of as a First Nations outlook. It's certainly not a monolithic thing, but it also helps us, I think, about what we can be working towards in Australia. But I know this applies in the other countries represented here amongst our audience of participants. So everyone, thank you very much for joining us today. And we do hope that we'll be able to see you again at some more events of this kind over the next year, particularly. You'll realize that this is part of the first part of a longer project that we have bringing together into dialogue our First Nations outlook on creation, together with what here in Australia anyway we call Celtic spirituality outlook. But could we just conclude now? We have, in a sense, reached a beautiful closure with the two blessings from Naomi, for which I do thank you, Naomi. But I think perhaps we could might also just conclude absolutely finally with more traditionally normal Sunday church kind of conclusion and prayer at the end. So could we just pray together? We thank God for being with us, and we need to commit each other to him. Loving Father of us all, we do give you our praise and thanks for the wonder of all your good creation, for the gift of your precious Son to die and bring us into eternal life with him, and for enabling us to meet here today. Thank you for being with us as these very important matters have been aired, and for bringing Brooke and Naomi to share their understanding and wisdom with the rest of us. Be with Rani now as she recovers from the shock of today's incident that's prevented her being with us in person, although we know that she is with us in spirit. Please help each one of us, wherever we may be located, to discern your work in and for creation, and to care for it properly as good stewards and good neighbours. Help us always to recognise the original and continuing land rights and land care of Australian First Nations people, and to acknowledge openly that they've never been ceded to others. Help us always to seek the truth in all things, knowing that in so doing we follow faithfully the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. And now may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen. Well, thank you. I know we're blessing each other, so this is not just from me. I know it's circulating amongst us, but I think now we'll sign off. And so thank you all for coming, and God bless. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. That was lovely and very helpful. Thank you.